This video is going to cover the first part of the 6.6 warm-up, and then we're going to finish the notes from 6.6 to cover kites. So the first thing we want to talk about is what we learned about trapezoids. Remember that trapezoids have one pair of parallel sides. So in a trapezoid, I have one pair of parallel sides. Those sides are called the bases. And the non-parallel sides are called the legs. The base angles are where those meet. So I've got one pair of base angles on the bottom and one pair of base angles on the top of this one. Then we learned about a trapezoid that is isosceles, or an isosceles trapezoid. That it means that these legs are congruent. So in an isosceles trapezoid, you've got congruent legs. And that means that the base angles are congruent. So in this case, angle 1 would equal angle 2, and angle 3 would equal angle 4. And then we learned about a mid-segment. The mid-segment connects the midpoints of the isosceles trapezoid. And the mid-segment is parallel to the bases, and it's equal to 1/2 the sum of the bases. So now we're going to apply those to the warm-up. If you haven't already, pause the video and give everybody about 5 to 7 minutes to finish these 2 questions, and then go ahead and hit play on the video so that everybody can continue to work and check their answers. Okay, so number 1 says find the measure of angle A, the measure of angle C, and the measure of angle D. In this diagram, we've got an isosceles trapezoid, which means we've got 2 base angles that are congruent. Angle C and angle B would be congruent, and angle D would be congruent to angle A. So if angle B is 56 degrees, then angle C is also 56 degrees. And then because these are parallel lines and this is a transversal, I know that these 2 angles are supplementary, these 2 angles are supplementary, which means that 56, when subtracted from 180, I get 124, and that's going to be this missing angle, which is also this missing angle, because A and D are congruent, and also these are supplementary. So angle A is 124, and angle D is also 124. Number 2 says AB is the mid-segment of the trapezoid DEFG. What is X? So remember that this is a mid-segment because it's connecting the 2 midpoints. This is congruent to this and this to this. So I know those are the midpoints. And 12 equals 1/2 the sum of the other 2 sides. So 5x minus 4 plus 8x plus 2. So I'm going to combine my like terms inside the parentheses. I'd get 12 equals 1/2 5 plus 8, which is 13x, or 5x, sorry, plus 8x, which is 13x, and then negative 4 and positive 2, which is minus 2. So we talked about it yesterday, but remember that if these are not even, I will probably avoid distributing the 1/2 in and dealing with fractions. Instead, I'm going to take and multiply that 2 by either side of the equal sign, or both sides of the equal signs. So I get 2 times 12 on the left, which is 24, and on the right-hand side, I get 2 times 1/2, so these cancel out, and then I don't need to distribute anything into the 13x minus 2. Now I'll continue to solve this equation by adding 2 to both sides of the equal sign. I get 26 equals 13x, negative 2 and positive 2 cancel out. And then I want to divide by 13 on either side of the equal sign. And I get x equals 2. And these are questions you can check by taking that answer and plugging it back in to these values. So if on the top I did 5 times 2 minus 4, I would get 10 minus 4, or 6. That's the value at the on the top of the trapezoid. On the bottom, I would do 8 times 2 plus 2, or 16 plus 2, which is 18. That's the bottom leg here, or the bottom base, sorry. And then I would see if the middle, the mid segment 12, is 1/2 the sum of these two. So 6 plus 18 would be 24, and 24 divided by 2 is 12. And that's how I know that this answer, x equals 2, is correct. Okay, chapter 6, section 6. So yesterday we talked about trapezoids, the parts of the trapezoid, the two theorems that the isosceles, if it's isosceles, then the base angles are congruent, and also that the diagonals are congruent. And then we worked through some examples. Segment, we talked about the mid-segment theorem, which is the two theorems we talked about earlier. And then we talked about the two parts we talked about earlier and solved this example. And now we're picking up with kites. So a kite is a quadrilateral with exactly 2 pairs of congruent consecutive sides. So a kite is different from a rectangle, let's say, because a rectangle has opposite pairs of congruent sides. The kite has consecutive, which means the ones next to each other. So this is going to be congruent to this, and this is congruent to this. Notice that there's no pair of parallel sides. So this is not a parallelogram at all, and it's not a trapezoid because it doesn't have exactly one pair. The shape actually looks like a kite. Theorem 6.22 or 622, which again, number not important, but what it says if a quadrilateral is a kite, then its diagonals are perpendicular. So where I draw my diagonals inside the kite, if they're perpendicular, it means they form a right angle. They actually form 4 right angles all the way around. This one says quadrilateral ABCD is a kite. What are the measures of angles 1 and 2? So it should be obvious which are the matching sides. Like I know BC matches CD and BA matches DA because those look to be the same length. They'll either be marked or it'll be obvious like that. So this is a kite, and again, it tells me up here, I would either have the markings on the diagram or it would be in the direction. And if that's the case, then I know that these diagonals are perpendicular. If the diagonals are perpendicular, then it means it forms 4 90-degree angles. 90 there, here, here, and here. Which means I already know that the measure of angle 1 is 90 degrees. Then angle 2 is here in my diagram. Okay? The only other measure I have is 40 down here. Well, you have to think about the part of this kite as though it is an isosceles triangle. If it's an isosceles triangle, because these two sides are the same, then the angles opposite those sides, so I'm going to ignore this line in the middle for now, would also be congruent. So if the angle on the bottom there is 40, then this is also 40. Now, if you focus on the triangle over here, I have 3 angles. The 3 angles should add up to 180, and I know 2 of those angles. This is 40, this is 90. So if I take and add 90 and 40 together, I get 130 degrees. All 3 of them add up to 180, so if I just do 180 minus 130, I get what's left over, which is 50 degrees, which is going to be angle 2. So in dealing with a kite, we remember that the sides are congruent, which makes it isosceles, and we remember that the diagonals are perpendicular, which means they form 90 degrees. All right, so we're going to review one more time everything that we talked about in 6-6. We talked about a trapezoid. By definition, one pair of parallel sides. Then we said they have bases, which are the parallel sides, legs, the non-parallel sides, and these are called base angles. And they go in pairs. Then we said if that trapezoid is isosceles, which means the two legs would be congruent, then base angles would be congruent. Angle 1 would equal angle 2. Angle 3 would equal angle 4. And also, diagonals are congruent. So AC would equal BD. Then we added in the mid-segment. So the mid-segment joins the midpoints of the two legs. And we said the mid-segment is parallel to the bases. So these, all three would be parallel to each other. And its length is 1/2 the sum of the bases. And now we've added on the kites. So all of that is trapezoids. And now we're adding on the kites. And the kite has two pairs of consecutive congruent sides. And the only other piece of information we know about a kite is that its diagonals are perpendicular. So not only does that wrap up today's lesson in 6.6, but that also wraps up everything that you need for your test, which is next week. So the test, which is next week, is going to cover 6.1 to 6.6, which we covered the polygons, the interior angles, the exterior angles. We talked about parallelograms. We talked about squares, rhombuses, rectangles, and then we added on the trapezoids and the kites. So to get your classwork grade for today, you're going to submit in one file. So one submission, the warm-up, part 1 of the warm-up, and the notes from 6.6 part 2. You will submit that before you leave, so you can do it right now before you forget, and then you'll be able to use the remaining time to work on the homework for the kites or 6.6 part 2 homework. In addition to that, you're going to want to start to work on your chapter review for the test, which is next week, Wednesday of next week. So if you'll, after you complete the trapezoid assignment, open up the chapter review and work on that, and I'll be able to answer questions on that on Tuesday. Have a great weekend.